Hello and welcome to the On the Couch podcast, the podcast that gives you the view from the therapist chair. I'm your host, John Dennis, a licensed professional counselor. You're listening to OTC episode 65 with Lynn Lyons, host of the Flusterclux podcast. Welcome back, OTC listeners. Bringing another episode to you. With episode 65, I talked to Lynn Lyons, who she hosts a podcast. She is an LCSW. She runs events for parents, trainings. She's done the TV circuit talking about her books and the podcast. She focuses quite a bit on dealing with anxiety, particularly in kids. Probably the most recent book is the Anxious Kids, Anxious Parents that she co-authored with Reed Wilson. And I don't know. I mean, I've said before, just on the scale of things, I would say the anxiety diagnoses are probably cover the largest amount of people. I would say globally, nationally. I mean, it's just seen such a huge increase, and obviously the last year or 2 years definitely did not help. But she talks a lot about, preparing to go back to school, how parents can help their kids, talking to their kids about their anxiety. And, the things that you can take away from what she teaches are just such like game-changing information. It's I'm so glad that I got the book for myself and have been able to read through it and implement some things in my own parenting, as well as in my clinical practice and in working with parents. But you'll hear us talk about just upcoming events that she has. If you want to check her out, you can find her at lynnlyons.com. So that's LYNNLYONS.com. And you can check out the podcast from there. You can find out the different parenting retreats that she is a part of. And check it out. You'll get something out of it. It'll definitely be worth it. Well, On the Couch listeners, I'm honored to have Lynn Lyons here with me, who is a co-host for the Flusterclux podcast. She's an author for Anxious Kids, Anxious Parents. She's a licensed clinical social worker, speaker. I mean, she does so many things. So, Lynn, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thank you for being gracious with your time. So, I gotta say right off the bat, I love the podcast, and the name is just genius. I've been dreading speaking with you just for this one thing of I don't know if you're familiar with Bridget Jones' Diary, but I always think of that scene when she is announcing her boss, Mr. Fitzherbert, and I'm like terrified that I'm gonna drop the F-bomb on air with the podcast.
Edit.
Yes. That's why Casey makes me sound intelligent and professional. So, on your end, you want to give a little bit of your background and the book and the podcast. I mean, what's the focus for you?
Sure. So I'm an anxiety person and probably more specifically anxiety in families. People oftentimes say I work with anxiety in kids, but I really don't feel like that's accurate because I don't see kids alone. Anxiety is a pretty generational, family-driven, and really social experience. And so part of what I'm always talking about is how do we have to make sure that we are including the adults that are involved in anxious children's lives. So one of my pet peeves, well, I guess pet peeve, well, one of the things that just is confusing to me is why you would work with an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old who's dealing with anxiety, and you would have the parents on the other side of the door. So I really work with families. I work with parents a lot. And I work with anxiety, of course. If you work with teenagers, you're working with anxiety, and then along comes depression if they don't help for the anxiety. I work with adults too, but mostly I would say I work with anxious families. That's my sweet spot.
Okay. And how out of all of the myriad of things did you land on anxiety? Is that the passion, or that's what you were seeing the most of, or yeah?
Yeah, I mean, the way it happened, I was working with a lot of different things, but probably seeing a lot of anxiety, of course. And this is probably, many years ago now. And so the way it sort of really kind of mushroomed is that I was going to do a workshop at my first national conference. And so I was trying to figure out what I was going to submit a proposal for. And a very wise person said to me, well, make sure if you submit a proposal, make sure it's something that you really like doing, because if your workshop goes well and people learn about you, this is going to become the area that they're going to pursue you about. This is what they're going to want you to talk about. So don't do a workshop on something that you don't like. So I thought, well, what do I really like to treat? And that was what I really like to treat. And so I did the proposal and I got into the workshop. And at the workshop, Reed Wilson, who I did not know at the time, came walking up to me and said he sat in on my presentation, and he came up and he introduced himself and he said, I really like what you had to say. And I said, thank you. And then he left. And then about a month later, he emailed me and said, you want to write a book together? And then off to the races it went.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's a pretty good company to be in. I mean, Reed, for those that don't know, is the co-author of the Anxious Kids, Anxious Parents. But yeah, he's got quite a background himself, and a lot of books with OCD and a lot of things in that anxiety wheelhouse. So, wow, That's so cool.
Yeah.
And diving into Anxious Kids, Anxious Parents, I really like the way that you have the chapters broken out in terms of like the puzzle pieces, and there's, it was terrifying a little bit reading through it as a parent, where I'm like, oh gosh, I do this, like, but at the same time, good, because it's like, okay, I'm not alone. Other people struggle with this. So yeah, can you kind of give just a general overview of the book?
Sure. So you're exactly right, is that we broke it down into those puzzle pieces. I think the thing that we were really focusing on, which I think we pulled off, and it's really how I work, is that we weren't really concerned or weren't really thinking about diagnostic categories. So we don't have a chapter on separation anxiety and phobias and generalized anxiety disorder. That's just not how we wanted to talk about it. We really wanted to talk about much more process than content, which is really the foundation of the work I think that both of us do. So we wanted to talk about sequentially, how can we give families an idea of how this thing shows up? How can we give them a roadmap from beginning to end of how it shows up, and then how do we address it when it arrives? And so we really thought long and hard about what are each of the steps that we would want to bring a family through, just as if they were coming in for treatment. And we're both very concrete in our treatment. We're both very skill-based. We're both very action-oriented. So that's how we thought about it. Yeah.
And looking at a lot of the mistakes that parents often make, I think prior to sort of off air, we were talking about prevention and pathologizing. I mean, is that one of the major mistakes you think people make, is that we jump too quickly to, oh, well, you have, dysregulated emotions, you must be bipolar, or, yeah.
Yeah, that's the mistake that mental health professionals make. It's not the mistake that parents make.
Okay. Yeah.
We're the ones with the psychobabble. We're the ones that are labeling kids. We're the ones that have taught the general public how to look at things through this pathological lens. We
Yes.
did that. They didn't do that. And unfortunately, they believe us, particularly teenagers. But the mistake parents make, and I think a lot of clinicians make this too. The phrase that I always use is that we don't want to do the disorder. So, and this is in anything that I treat. I treat mostly anxiety, but of course, it's not just, I don't not treat other things. But what we want to look at is what do the patterns of anxiety demand? And let's make sure that we're not meeting its demands. So if we think of anxiety wants certainty and comfort. Anxiety wants to know exactly what's going to happen. Anxiety wants to make sure everything goes smoothly. Anxiety doesn't want to think about what it's anxious about. Anxiety gets really anxious about anxiety. It's very avoidant. And so when we step in and we start saying, okay, so if you're anxious about this, let's make sure that we give you as much information as possible so you know exactly what's going to happen so you don't have to worry about it. Or if you really have a hard time thinking about this, let's give you these distraction techniques so that you don't have to think about it. So when it shows up, we're going to give you a fidget spinner, or we're going to give you a stress ball, or we're going to create a safe room where you can go and get away from all these feelings. All of that stuff is incredibly common and incredibly counterproductive.
Mm-hmm.
I just said to somebody the other day, if you give me a stress ball, I'm going to whip it at your head. I didn't say that. I didn't say that to a client. I said that. I don't want any more stress balls, because I think what we're missing when we do that is that it really is about emotional management, and it really is about being able to tolerate uncertainty and tolerate unpredictability and tolerate discomfort and normalizing it. We all have these feelings. And when we step in, and this is what parents want to do, of course, because they want to take away distress.
Mm-hmm.
So of course that's what they want to do, right? We want to make it go away. But schools do it in spades. I mean, absolutely. Therapists, you can go online and look up best accommodations for anxious students, and you will see lists on websites about anxious kids that teach schools and parents how to help your child avoid. And it just doesn't make sense. Yeah.
And in that, some of that, yeah, you speak to the, as parents, yeah, we sort of naturally do that. We want to protect. So yeah, a lot of times we go to that over detailing, over explaining, and do you see it as it just kind of kicks the can, or we're just sort of walking around the minds?
Yeah, I mean, it can kick the can, but it also can make things worse because it sets up the expectation that that's what you need in order to move forward. Mm-hmm. So say, and where you see it developmentally is that if you're little, and I'm not saying that it's an all or nothing thing, right? We all need information sometimes. And when you step into a new situation, somebody's got to tell you how it works. We don't just drop kids off and say, figure it out. But developmentally, when you are little, parents need to give you information. They need to give you reassurance. Everything that I talk about, I want done in the context of love and encouragement and support, of course. But if you become a family where the anxiety, which I refer to as a cult leader, says, you have to do everything per my demands or we're going to have a problem. So parents step in and they start putting in these safety behaviors. They start putting in these rigid routines. They start demanding that other people avoid anything that might upset their child. And again, they're doing it because they're trying to keep the train on the tracks. Eventually, developmentally, this kid is going to hit a point where they don't know how to function independently. They don't know how to manage disappointment. They don't know how to manage worry. And if this continues, through elementary school and then through middle school and through high school, where it really hits the fan oftentimes is it's now time for this child to graduate from high school and move on in life, and it doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. They don't know how to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, I sort of think of that, some of the failure to launch, the misperception often that, oh, well, the IEP is going to transition into, the community, or there is no IEP. I mean, definitely at college, there often are the Department of Disability Services or whatever they call it at that particular college. But that doesn't exist out in the rest of the world.
Right. Yeah. And so it really is, for me, I'm always thinking and I'm always asking parents, say you've got a kid who's having a particularly difficult fifth grade year, and let's, imagine that it's sort of normal and not, you haven't just spent the year and
it's not so hard to imagine that year.
But I will say to parents, and I will say to schools if I'm working with this school, how would you define a successful fifth grade year? What do you want your child to be able to do at the end of fifth grade so that they're better equipped as they move into sixth grade? And we can get caught up in all the academic things we want them to achieve. But really, if you don't know how to fill in the blank, and a lot of it has to do with social relationships and connection and being able to manage feelings and being able to manage disappointment, if you have never gotten through those things, then how can we help you move forward? So this idea that if we put all these safety behaviors around you in the absence of skill building, if it's avoidance in the absence of skill building, then kids never learn that, you know what, I can screw up and be okay. I can get my heart broken and be okay. I can hand something in and have it not be perfect and be okay. I can be scared and be okay. The more we prevent them from having those experiences, if I think about my life and you think about your life, right? We're both old and grizzled, and we think about our lives. We think about all the things that we had to handle. That's where our confidence comes from. That's where our esteem comes from, right? The fact that you did this thing and you screwed up and you managed it and you got through it, and then you say to yourself, all right. I guess I can handle when things don't go the way that I want them to go. But the more we step in and do the disorder, do the anxiety, work for the anxiety, the worse the problem gets and the more ill-equipped these kids are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Where I see this the most, I think, is especially with the reassuring questions. I have a number of clients that, they go to their parents for reassurance, and it's this black hole that you can never fill in. Like a minute after they've asked the reassuring question, they're asking it again and again and again. And do you see some of this also as, we as parents are, I don't want to say creating it, but like a lot of this is like some of our own anxiety, our own stuff that we haven't dealt with, and we're modeling it and teaching it a lot of times through I'm going to protect you from what I went through, or
Yeah. I mean, one of the last episode that we did on the podcast was the dynamic between when you have an anxious parent and a non-anxious parent, and how those two parents, it really is hard on a marriage, or if they're not married, whatever, but it's hard on a parenting situation, because the anxious parent can be so empathic. The anxious parent says, you know what, this is how I felt when I was in third grade, and I do not want my child to feel this way. So they're very empathic, and also they are teaching their child how to manage the worry the same way they manage the worry. Mm-hmm. If they've never figured it out, or they've never been able to talk about it or to know how this thing works, they're just doing what they know. Then you've got the non-anxious parent that's like, oh my God, stop coddling this kid. And, we need to push him into these situations. And oftentimes the dynamic just gets farther and farther apart. The anxious parent now wants to make up for the daredevil approach of the other parent. And the other parent wants to make sure that they're giving their kid experiences because the anxious parent won't let them do anything. But of course we bring our own experience into parenting, our own lives, our own worries, our own fears, our own crap. That's the way parenting works.
Mm-hmm. And the dynamic that you referenced in the last episode, I do a lot of Gottman couples work, and I see that dynamic quite a lot.
Yeah, people will say to me, "Well, is it worse? Is it worse if you have two anxious parents or if you have one of each?" It's kind of a toss-up depending on the day.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, and very rarely do I have an anxious kid and there's not an anxious parent. That's just the way this thing works.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it happens every once in a while, but not too frequently.
Well, and I often say that's some of why I enjoy working with anxiety and people that struggle with that, because I think it's something we all deal with at varying degrees, whether that's clinically significant or not. But often and I think you talk about this in the book. I often reference that like whack-a-mole sort of like, okay, I dealt with it over here and then it like pops up over here as something else. But a lot of times it can be very, kind of formulaic of like, okay, you were able to deal with it in this arena. So now we just have to figure out how to do it in this one.
Right. Yeah. And that's the process approach. Like you were talking about the reassurance that we get caught in.
Mm-hmm.
You're just trying to offer information about this problem. Sometimes it's the same question over and over. But it is the whack-a-mole. So first, I'm worried about this, then I'm worried about that, then I'm worried about that. And I think that's the mistake that a lot of people make. I think it's a mistake that clinicians make, and certainly parents, they're just doing their best, is that we get caught up in the content. And so we think that the solution to the anxiety is to deal with the content and to figure out how can I change the world in order to satisfy the anxiety disorder. And it really is much more about how do I change my relationship to my anxiety when it shows up. When the worry shows up, how do I respond to it? Not how do I make the world more certain and more comfortable and more even and more predictable.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I liked Kristen Ulmer, The Art of Fear. She talks a lot about the extreme sport side of things, often that approach of like, I just have to conquer my fear and deny my fear and push it way down. And it's kind of like trying to put water on a grease fire where it spreads it all over the place. And so in terms of helping parents, helping kids, is there a concept or a technique that you'd be able to teach here and now of just real brief of, how to start to shift that some?
Yeah, so I talk about the 3 X's, right? We're going to expect the worry to show up, we're going to externalize it, and then we're going to experiment with it. So we really want to, the first thing that you want to help people do is to be able to get some distance between themselves and this thing called, if they call it their worry or they call it their anxiety, so that they become an observer of it, right? So it's a little mindfulness type thing. This is why mindfulness is helpful, because it puts you in the role of the observer. But we really want to have them externalize it and personify it in a way so that they hear or experience, what goes on when they're worried and how they react to it. So the first thing that I want families to do, we all pull it out and give it a name, and we can name it Agnes or we can name it Joanne or whatever, and listen to the consistency of it. So even though the content might be different, you might be afraid of snakes, you might be afraid of people, you might be afraid of vomiting, you might be afraid of everything. The language or the approach of anxiety is always the same. It always says some version of, you can't handle it, right? And whatever the content is, doesn't matter to me, really. I don't spend a lot of time investigating or trying to figure out why you're afraid of this. It's either obvious or not. Either got bit by a dog or you didn't, but you're afraid of dogs. It doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is when the worry shows up, what's your response to it? And how do we do the opposite of what the disorder wants? Because we're always trying to give that little amygdala some new data. We're trying to give it some new information. And what families do is when the worry shows up, when the anxiety shows up, they want to get rid of the anxiety. So we want to, the shift we want to make is that we're not going to eliminate. We're going to observe, we're going to expect it, and then we're going to step in and we're going to change our relationship to it. And sometimes that's in a very exaggerated way. I'll give you an example. I have a girl that I'm working with who is a delight, and she she has OCD, pretty dramatic, and it's completely focused on what her mom does. So if her mom coughs, or if her mom is drinking water, if her mom shows any, rubs her nose, like sniffs. And so we are doing the opposite of what the disorder wants her to do. We want the mom to stop accommodating. Mom would say, oh, I'm just careful not to drink water around her, or I'm careful not to clear my throat, or I'm careful, right? No, we're not going to do that, right? Accommodations don't work. They make it worse. But if I were to just say to the mom, I want you to just cough around your daughter and have her get used to that, that's not going to work, because they're all going to have the same reaction. So what they're doing now, which is working pretty well, is I want the girl to do the opposite, which is what? To say to mom, could you please drink some water for me? Oh, please drink more water. To say, when her mom coughs, she says to, and we practice these lines, right? Very rote responses. Oh my gosh, Mom, thank you for helping me practice with my OCD. Mm-hmm. Thank you for helping me, which is and it's still hard for her. She'll say it through tears sometimes. Thank you for helping me practice my OCD. But it's about, how do we step in? Mm-hmm. It's really changing the dynamic and not being so careful, and so treating these kids like they're so fragile, putting the anxiety disorder in charge of what we do and what we don't do, treating them as if they're like these little ticking time bombs that we have to make sure that we don't set off. That's why it's so important to have the parents involved. They need a lot of coaching.
Yeah. And I'm trying to find at the end of the first chapter of the, I know for myself as a parent, I struggle a lot of times with the, the getting frustrated, the trying to force it, or trying to control it out of your kids. And it's always such a struggle of, because when that flipped lid happens and the shut off comes, you're not talking to the same kid, and often parents are trying to logic their kids through the anxiety, and it's and then they get more and more frustrated. I've had a lot of parents then start to turn to, kind of mixing just the eclectic Dan Siegel terms and Gottman terms of, like, the parents will then, when the logicking doesn't work, then they'll use the contempt. They'll start to almost make fun of the kid or the anxiety, and get very passive aggressive, which obviously doesn't make it better, doesn't make it go away. It actually makes it worse. It's almost like guaranteed need for therapy for your kid.
Yeah. Throwing a little contempt at them is really a good way to run up your therapy bill, for sure. Yeah.
Job security.
And I think that's why it's so important. Again, as I said at the beginning, totally, really, truly mind-boggling to me how many times I hear from parents, oh, my 6-year-old is in therapy for his anxiety, or my 10-year-old is in therapy for his anxiety. And I say, well, what are you doing? What are the goals of treatment? And they're like, oh, we want to give her privacy. Parents need a lot of coaching in this, because the thing about anxiety, and this is the thing about, I don't know what it's like for you, but certainly for me, when somebody is being passive or refusing, right? And you just, it's like that old Saturday Night Live skit where that guy, there would be a problem, and he would say, just fix it, right? You just do it, right? You just get on the bus, and you just want them to do it. So of course, up comes all your frustration, and then you feel like you should be able to fix it, and your kid's not cooperating. And so that's when parents, without a good, solid plan of how to react, and without a lot of coaching in terms of that this is normal, this is what's going to happen, that's when parents just start to throw the kitchen sink at it. So they start off trying to be, nice and empathic and reassuring, and then they start, like you say, being really logic. So if we can just give you some data, if we can just give you some statistics, if we can just give you some information, if we could just give you some reassurance, and then when that doesn't work, then they start punishing, they start taking away things, and then when they start feeling really hopeless and pissed off, that's when they start getting sarcastic. That's when they say, well, you know what, fine. If you want to be a a little baby for the rest of your life, then go ahead and be a little bit, and we know when you get to that point, the train is off the tracks, right? We're not
Sure.
getting any. Yeah.
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 Have you seen, through COVID, are there pieces of this that you've had to change some of like the 7 puzzles or the some of how you apply some of what you teach now, or is it just okay now it's just on like a magnified scale because the anxiety has gotten so bad for people and so much more? You're listening to OTC episode 65 with Lynn Lyons, host of the Flusterclux podcast. We'll be right back after a brief word from our sponsor.
Would you like to talk to a counselor but can't find the time? Would you rather talk to someone from the comfort of your own home? If so, Parenting and Family Solutions is here to help. We now offer teletherapy to all clients who reside in the state of Pennsylvania. Using our secure portal, you can have a video session with your counselor using a laptop, desktop computer, or smartphone. Visit our website to learn more at www.parentfamilysolutions.com or give us a call at 717-602-5560 to see if teletherapy might be a good fit for you. Let us help you build a stronger family and a healthier you.
Have you seen, through COVID, are there pieces of this that you've had to change some of like the 7 puzzles or the some of how you apply some of what you teach now, or is it just okay now it's just on like a magnified scale because the anxiety has gotten so bad for people and so much more?
Yeah, I don't know that I think the one thing that's probably been the most challenging for me, because I'm really big on homework assignments and going out and trying things. And
exposure therapy and in the pandemic is
particularly with social anxiety. How do you have a 13-year-old practice their social conversations? Because I'll have kids go into a store, wherever you send them out. They're not even in school. And a lot of those kids were delighted to be at home. The cocoon was the wonderful place for them to be. So that was the most challenging. We had to be really creative with that. I think it's interesting as I look at sort of what's been happening as things have been opening back up. And I would have predicted this. There was a lot of kids that enjoyed this only because their anxiety said, yeehaw, we don't have to go out into the world. Yeah. Kids on the spectrum, adults on the spectrum, not having to venture out into the challenging social minefield of what it's like to be somebody on the spectrum dealing with other human beings. And what I thought would happen and what is happening is that now it's really hard for them to garner up the motivation to put themselves back into the fray. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the momentum that kids had and the good positive reinforcement that we were able to experience, a lot of those kids, and these kids also that I don't treat, I'm hearing this a lot from schools, is that she used to be able to come into school and now she's been out for 6 months and now we can't get her back.
Yeah.
That's the thing that we're dealing with right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Throughout, I've been saying, just the extroverts, a lot of them got hit really hard right at the front end. And a lot of the introverts are more like, oh, I've been training for this my whole life. This is great. And yeah, now on the other side, the reentry is not as smooth. You have a lot of parents that were like, all right, let's go. It's time to go back to work. And the kid's like,
Yeah. And it was interesting too with anxious families. The beginning, it was sort of like an anxiety sandwich, because at the beginning there was so much anxiety. It was so chaotic. It seems like forever ago, but we didn't know what was going on, and we were wiping down our groceries with bleach, and it was really talk about uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And then we went into this prolonged period of we sort of got the hang of it, and the fun was over, right there.
Yeah, the novelty.
And the concerts ended, right? And everybody stopped applauding the healthcare workers, and then we all just got through the winter. But the anxious people were like, okay, so now we know this routine. We're in our houses here. We know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
So even amongst the uncertainty, there was a period of certainty. Like, this is what our day looks like. And that did feel good to them. Now that we're starting to reopen, all of the anxiety about how much to do, how to make decisions, do I send my kid back? Where do I go? All of that's back. So for the families, it was sort of like, and then, ooh, kind of easy. And then now it's, again. That's what I've seen.
Yeah. And I don't want to really, I don't want to touch the vaxxing, anti-vaxxing, but yeah, I would imagine, are you anticipating some of the anxiety connected to that? Of, you normally, a lot of kids do not like shots, understandably. Yeah. But as they've looked at lowering the age for that, are you anticipating a wave of that as well?
Oh yeah, I've already started getting emails. They just, here in New Hampshire, they just put it to the 12 to 15-year-olds.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so just this morning, I got an email from a parent saying my child is terrified of needles. I got an email from a therapist I don't know saying, how do I help with I have a client who's got to get her vaccine and she's freaking out. So sure, that's just content. And so this just happens to be the content of the day. Mm-hmm. What was the content at the beginning of the pandemic? Contamination. Boy, my OCD contamination people were off the rails because now, right? They're like, oh my gosh. And so it's just the content shifts. The needle people weren't all jacked up at the beginning of the pandemic, but they're jacked up now. So that's just the way this thing works, is how does your anxiety grab onto what it grabs onto and then try and avoid. And it's whatever the flavor of the day is that we're going to be dealing with. Yeah.
Care to share what that email address is? It's, again, it's always something. I mean, it shifts around, it migrates,
Which is when, if we're teaching kids about anxiety and teaching them about depression and teaching them about emotional management and mood management, teaching them about relationships, it's all, the thing that I say all the time is that prevention and treatment for anxiety and depression are virtually indistinguishable. All the things that I teach in my office are the very same things that I would want kids to start learning as early as possible, because it's all about how do we manage what we do inside to ourselves in connection to what the world does to us too. And if we can teach kids emotional management, if we can teach them to tolerate uncertainty, if we can teach them to assess reasonable risk, which is a really good skill to have in life and certainly during a pandemic, they're going to be more equipped. So, it's nothing. There's nothing new. The pandemic is just another playground for anxiety to play.
Yeah, it just ramped it up and put it on a more global scale, all at the same time, I think. Normally I ask this towards the end, but I'll ask it now. I think you set it up pretty well. I imagine there's probably a number of parents that are listening. They're like, oh gosh, I do all of these things. I'm like irreparably damaged my kid. But there's a lot of others that, maybe they had a child during this and, they have a baby. They're not really at that anxiety stage yet. Yeah, if you were in charge of mental health for the entire country or the globe, what would be a couple of concepts that you would really hammer that you would want everybody to know and try to teach their kids?
That's such a good question. So there are really four things that we see pretty consistently in the research when we look at anxious parents and anxious kids. And what are the skills, or what are the ways it shows up in anxious kids? So if we look at the four things that we know, then we can look at what the skills are we want to teach. So one is that this tolerating uncertainty. So the ability to tolerate uncertainty. If you are raised in an anxious environment, you are lousy at tolerating uncertainty. So I talk to parents about being able to roll around in the mights and maybes of life. You really want to work on flexibility, because rigidity is one of those early signs that shows up. if you've got a really rigid 3-year-old, if you've got a really rigid 5-year-old, if you are a really rigid 37-year-old, being flexible is an enormously helpful skill. So you can start talking about that with your kids at a very early age. I tell families to create a wall of flexibility. So you pick a door in your house, you grab a bunch of sticky notes, and every time your child handles something flexibly, then you put up a little sticky note and you start saying to your kids, we value the ability to be flexible. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have rules and expectations and all that kind of stuff, but we value the ability to be flexible. So that would be the first thing. The other thing we know about kids raised in worried environments is that they're not very good independent problem solvers. And when we look at their level of autonomy, it's lower than we'd like it to be. So being able to create autonomy in your children, being able to allow them to solve problems, being able to allow them to step into things, right? Lengthening the leash rather than shortening the leash is a really, really important skill to think about if you're parenting. This is, and you said, some people might be listening and saying, like, oh, I've irreparably damaged my kids. I always say it's good to start early, but it's never too late. You can talk to a teenager about this. And you can say, you know what, I recognize that we've been doing this in kind of an anxious way. Let's think about how we can change it up. And then the third thing really is teaching kids how to assess risk. Because if you're an anxious parent and you're catastrophic and you're talking to them a lot about what dangers there are in the world, we know that kids raised by anxious parents perceive the world as a more dangerous place. So they come to more dangerous conclusions about situations. They project danger onto things that kids not raised by anxious parents don't do the same thing. So being able to recognize your safety chatter, recognize how much you talk about danger, recognize how often you say to your kids, oh, be careful. Oh, don't do that. Oh, watch out. Oh. When your kid leaves the house, do you give them a lecture about all the possible dangers and what could befall them? All of that stuff raises anxiety in kids. So it's not all or nothing. I'm not saying that we pile kids back in the pickup truck again, but recognizing that your perceptions of the world and how you step in and how you offer that to children with your modeling and your language makes a huge difference. Yeah. I talk about being uncooked spaghetti versus being cooked spaghetti, right? I need you to be cooked spaghetti here.
Yeah, I like that. And I mean, obviously all of those things are hugely important. And I was going to bring up the, that black or white, all or nothing. Because I think I always tell clients and the idea that all or nothing is the easy part. The balance, that's the hard part of, like you said, we're not just going to go all the way back to like, all right, you're 8, it's time for you to take your own ADHD medication and be responsible for that. Or, you're not just going to like completely make them self-sufficient too young, but not overdoing it the other way either. So, yeah. Wow. And I would imagine, a lot of the concepts you teach are ageless. They translate to anybody that may struggle with some of these things. What are some, I don't know if I would say conditions, but just what are things that often get confused for anxiety? Mm-hmm. What are things that, I think I often see ADHD and anxiety going together. But yeah, are there ones that you see?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, I see things actually, I see anxiety getting missed oftentimes. So I'm very, I work with kids and they can come to me at a pretty young age. I'll tell you a very typical sort of presentation is that this child was diagnosed with ADHD when they were 5. and now they're 12. And then they got diagnosed with anxiety when they were 10. And now the parents are saying, gosh, we're thinking that maybe it's actually the anxiety that's running the show and that they don't have ADHD. So I see ADHD being diagnosed very quickly and very early. And I'll tell you where it really is interesting is OCD in schools. So if a child has obsessive compulsive disorder, they are very often diagnosed with ADHD by people who don't know anything about OCD. So what they see is a kid being distracted. They see a kid being unable to sit in their seat, unable to complete their work. Many times kids who have OCD and it's not recognized and it's not diagnosed are given the label of having ADHD. I see that missed a lot. And if you know OCD and you know how it operates and you know the questions to ask, it's really not very hard to recognize it. It sort of screams at me when I see it. But that happens a lot for sure. Yeah. And I think it's important to recognize the pathway of anxiety into depression, particularly for adolescents. I have issues with the language oftentimes that we use with teenagers to talk about depression and the permanence of it and the disease model, that this is this thing that you're going to have forever. And now you have depression and you've been diagnosed with depression. I think it's really important for people to be informed about the fact that the reason that anxiety often leads to depression is because anxiety takes you out of your life. Anxiety says, I don't care. I say this to kids all the time. Your anxiety does not give one iota, whether or not you play Little League, whether or not you go to school, whether or not you go to camp, whether or not you hang out with your friends, whether or not you apply to college, whether or not you can go and get a part-time job, whether or not you're going to take that babysitting course. Anxiety doesn't care about any of those things, but you do. And when anxiety shows up and starts pulling you out of all the things that are interesting or fun or important to you, you start to feel more and more depressed because as an adolescent, your mandate is to be with your people, and anxiety is working against that. So very often it moves into depression, but people then will say, well, she has anxiety and now she also has this chemical imbalance called depression. And I say, no, let's just look at how this thing happened. This is a social phenomena. This was a long time coming. Mm-hmm. Really being able to educate families about these different, these different labels that we give kids that really deserve a much more informed discussion, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I liked, the way you're talking about anxiety and I'll often try to, like you said, you can name it whatever you want, but talking about it as this entity that you're sort of fighting against.
Yeah.
And I've heard that, I have ADHD, ADHD doesn't have me, or, fill in the blank, whether that's anxiety or cancer or whatever. And yeah, thinking of it as like, that is separate from who I am. That is not my identity, or that doesn't encapsulate all of me.
And perhaps even more importantly is that there are things that you do that make it better, and there are things that you do that make it worse, right? I mean, there are things that we can learn. If you are somebody who has ADHD, or you're somebody who is prone to depression because you have several risk factors, if you're somebody who has OCD, which has a pretty strong genetic push to it, there are things that you can do to make it better, and there are things that you do that make it worse. And we really need to talk very directly to young people about that. And just by the way, when I say that, it totally pisses them off.
Yes, but and it's so often I find it such an odd thing that almost like an autoimmune disease. Like we're sort of attacking ourselves. Whether that's with depression, okay, the very thing I need is energy and motivation, and that's the thing that's being sapped, or the avoidance, and it like creates more of it.
It's such a cycle. And when we've got the anxiety and the depression working together, they're really good at spiraling somebody down into isolation and into avoidance. And so, when I talk about this, I think sometimes people say, well, I know people say, because they said it to me, they say, well, makes it sound so simple. She makes it sound like you just have to do this. I am not saying that at all. But what I am saying is that anxiety in particular is not all that mysterious. We know exactly how it works, right? I say, I love my job, but I say the same thing over and over and over again. And that's really what I want kids to recognize, is that that it's really common. When I'm in front of a crowd of people, I'll say, does anybody have a family that's completely free of anxiety and depression and substance abuse? Anybody have one of those families? And of course, nobody raises their hand. I can't raise my hand. You can't raise your hand. So when we start talking about it in just that this is a part of being a human being, and how can we teach you about you? And how can we talk to you about your operating system and what you need to know about you? And that if you don't get enough sleep, this is what happens. And if you don't get outside and exercise, this is what happens. And if you don't see people, this is what happens. Or if you surround yourself with these kind of people, this is what happens. It all becomes about skill building and understanding how you operate. It's just a far better way, in my opinion, than saying to a kid, you have a chemical imbalance, there's something wrong with your brain, and you're going to have this forever, and now we need to put accommodations around you to make sure that, we treat you as if you are this thing. Rather than saying, you've got this thing, let's figure out what we need to do, let's figure out what works, let's figure out what and we have it's a very active and very skill-based approach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I often think of Pink Floyd's Mother, that, where the things we do a lot of times are like, I'm going to keep you safe and warm here, and no one will ever, bother you. But then you're going to stay here and no one will ever bother you. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I did want to ask, where you have a conference coming up. My understanding is October, I think it's 22nd through the 24th.
Yeah.
So, can you kind of lay that out? That's for parents, that's for families, that's. Yeah,
it's a parenting retreat. So we do a few, so this is in the Flusterclux side of things. So if you've listened to Flusterclux, I do it with my sister-in-law, Robin. So Robin is married to my brother. And Robin, her other hat is that she is a travel expert extraordinaire. She's handy to have around. So this that we're having, this parenting retreat, is October 22nd through 24th. It's at Canyon Ranch. So if you haven't ever been to Canyon Ranch, it is like a slice of heaven, but it's an expensive slice of heaven. So this is this is kind of the luxury retreat thing that she does. And then and this is what we're going to do. And then COVID hit, of course, but we're going to have other retreats that are not at such a luxury destination. But this one, it's pretty sweet. I'm looking forward to it. And I do a bunch of trainings. I've got a clinical training on June 4th for clinicians. In the fall, I will probably do a school-based training. I've done those in the past. Maybe I'll be able to do it live. We'll see. So we've got a lot of things in the hopper once we're opened up and can move around a little bit.
And where can people find you or register for those? What's the website? Yeah.
So my website is just lynlyons.com.
And so Lyons.
Lynn, no E, like Fred Lynn. Mm-hmm. Lynn Lyons, for those Boston people. People are like, who's Fred Lynn? Fred Lynn was a Boston Red Sox that I was going to marry, and my name was going to be Lynn, and we were going to live in Lynn, Massachusetts. It worked out. I did pretty well. I went to Lynn Lyons, so I just had to add a few letters. But so it's lynlyons.com, and then there's also Flusterclux with an X.com. That's the podcast. And all information about my books and trainings. And I'm on Twitter. My Facebook page, if you just look up Lynn Lyons and put in Lynn Lyons Anxiety, you'll get my professional page. Yeah. So I try and put stuff out there. There's a lot of free resources for sure.
Yes. Yeah. I highly recommend, people check it out. The book has been, as a parent and as a clinician, been very useful. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
I keep saying, and I've not accomplished it yet. I need to start having guests on that are like couch potatoes and do nothing that will make me feel better. But nobody would want to listen to those episodes. So, but I did see. I think you all hit what, like 200,000 downloads? Was it?
Yeah, 200,000.
Nice.
Yeah, so that's a big number. It's not like we're keeping up with Dax Shepard, but and again, that all credit goes to Robin, because it was March and we were going to do this and this and this, and we had talked about a podcast, and she was like, "All right, we got to start the podcast," and she just figured it out. She just did it.
Nice.
So we've been doing it just for about a year, and it's been this is Reed Wilson texting me right now, actually. Jing.
Tell Reed we say hello.
So we've I guess we've put out about 60 episodes now. It's been fun. I am trying to focus on doing things that feel frictionless in all of this, and the podcast is definitely one of them.
Nice. That's awesome that it's fun. It's such a cool concept. I mean, also with family.
Yeah.
It's so awesome to see you all do that and hear how much fun you have with it, and that it's a passion in addition to, an amazing resource for people that's helped a lot of people. So thank you.
Welcome. You're welcome. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, I'm really glad we were able to put this together, and thank you for being flexible with your time. So take care, and we'll stay in touch.
All right. Thank you so much for having me, John. Your questions were great, and it's fun for me to talk about this stuff with somebody who's in the trenches and is able to ask such insightful questions. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm in a lot of trenches right now. Well, take care.
Bye-bye.
There you have it, OTC listeners. Another episode done. Thanks for stopping by and checking out the show. A huge thank you to Lynn Lyons for being on and being generous with her time. It's always such a pleasure to have guests on and just add them to the OTC army of clinicians and world changers and thought leaders that are trying to advance mental wellness for our planet. That's kind of what this show is all about. So I really appreciate the opportunity to do that. Next episode will be OTC episode 66, where I'll be talking with Dr. Catherine Ramsland about the difference between mass shooting events, spree killings, serial killers, and we talk a little bit about psychological autopsies. Dr. Catherine Ramsland, she's written, something like 60 plus books on these various topics. So stop by and check it out.